Hello and welcome to the Lend Hoping Nothing podcast. I'm Michael Humphreys and I'm happy to be talking to you today. This is episode 13 and I kind of wanted this to be another musing moment because I'm interested in kind of talking about economic value and how we get there. So I've been in some conversations with a fellow on Twitter about especially the Austrian theory of economics, and I've been rereading some stuff from Father Thomas Devine in his book on usury, and he focuses on understanding economic value from the Austrian perspective as well. And from this, he derives a way of justifying taking usury generally without any of the extrinsic titles that maybe the late scholastics would have relied on. And so this has kind of really gotten me thinking about, well, how do we come up with a coherent theory of economic value? Because I think the theory that the Austrians put forward is interesting, and it appeals oftentimes to Catholics because it is philosophically grounded. So it seems to be arise from deductive reasoning about the human nature and so forth. The issue with it is that, from my perspective at least, first of all, I think it's contrary to Catholic teaching because I think it was Innocent X explicitly condemns time preference, which is a central proposition, I guess, of Austrian economics. And he condemns it as an excuse for usury. So not that it's not useful, it's not conceptually important in some more narrow region, just that it can't be used as an excuse for usury. So I think, therefore, Austrian theory, from the Catholic perspective, has to be constricted. And constricted in a way that I don't think Austrian theory has the internal conceptual framework to justify. So, but one of the advantages of the way that the Austrians think is they think about it in terms of preferences and hierarchies of preference, and how then that drives the way we value and behave in the marketplace. So it becomes a way of predicting behavior based on how we, this hierarchy of our preferences. So the issue, though, I have with this, and this is coming from Father Devine, is that the initial presumption is that economics as a science is concerned with the valuation of goods or behaviors. And I don't think that's principally true. So let me kind of walk through it a little bit. I think economics principally and primarily is concerned with the meeting of human needs and how we go about that. So in this sense, it takes human nature as something fundamental, something axiomatic. So it doesn't try to tell us what human nature is. It doesn't tell us what human needs are. It just takes it as given. And so the first kind of, because it's concerned with how we meet those needs, especially those material needs, is it has to take human nature as normative for the science. So, for example, we do not have an economics of how to acquire poison as food, because that doesn't actually meet a human need. It doesn't actually feed people. And so this human nature becomes the sort of normative ground for those needs, for understanding what those needs are. And so it doesn't consider any needs whatsoever. So we're not considering dog needs or, alligator needs or whatever. We're considering specifically human needs. And it's like, okay, so human nature is the grounding. So let's consider how we kind of go about making those economic decisions. Because once you've established the ground of those economic needs, valuation comes on top of that as a methodology or framework for understanding how we go about satisfying those needs in a world of scarce resources. And so, do I go and I get water from the well, or do I go and get water from the river? Or do I go get an apple, or do I go get some wheat for bread, and so forth? And so there's valuation then becomes a way of determining which way to go in this world of multiplicity of desires or needs, and then a multiplicity of goods that could potentially meet those needs, and goods that are scarce and that we have to go and acquire. So, at a fundamental level, and this has to do with our biological constitution. So when we perceive something, and this is kind of getting into perception and epistemology, which I think is an important point with respect to the Austrian theory. So when we sense something, so we see color, we hear sound, so forth, there is on top of or after that sensation a perceptual judgment about it. And here we kind of start at the animal level. And so when a sheep hears the sound of a wolf's howl, it makes a perceptual judgment about that howl. This is something to be avoided. This is something to run away from. Whereas when it sees, the green leaves of grass, this is something to be pursued. This is something that can be food. Now, alternatively, the wolf, when it hears the other wolf's howl, this becomes maybe something to approach, maybe something good. When it sees the grass, because they're not herbivores, it's something to just be ignored and move on. And so they're based on our biological constitution. There are different ways in which we naturally sort of make these perceptual judgments. And so, that's why we have to take human nature as sort of fundamental axiomatic to this question of economics. So, but the issue then, so it depends on, first of all, our biological constitution. But second of all, this perceptual judgment can err. So the lamb or the sheep hears the wolf sound and runs away, but if that wolf sound was just a recording of a wolf, or maybe it was just the wind or something, that becomes an error in judgment at that perceptual level, even for animals. And so that has consequences. That error has consequences for that animal's ability to meet its needs. So rather than just ignoring it because it's not a real wolf, it then goes off and runs away. Alternatively, if it doesn't recognize a wolf's howl as a wolf, that also has consequences, because then it might be eaten. And so, in the one case, the error might lead to a lack of food. In the other case, the error might lead to becoming food. So at this perceptual level, there is the possibility of error. And this possibility of error is the ground for not being able to meet those needs that we are seeking. So then we reach this kind of higher rational level, where this kind of perceptual judgment is the ground or source material for our intellectual judgments. So we no longer see things just as, oh, this is desirable or this is something I should be afraid of, but we distinguish the thing like the grass or the howl, as something in itself apart from our desire of it. Because that perceptual judgment is adding something to that sense experience. And so untangling that becomes that first moment of intellectual awareness. And so being able to understand the thing itself and our own desires and judgments about it then becomes that first stage of intellection. Now, as we start to look at that thing and understand it and understand our desires and understand our own human nature, we can begin to then structure a hierarchy of goods. So, should I pursue this or should I pursue this? Well, classically, opportunity cost is a big thing. So if I pursue this one thing, then I'm not going to pursue this other thing. And so there's some sort of valuation because there's trade-offs going on. And so you can start thinking about these different trade-offs and structuring, okay, so given the needs I have, I will make a particular judgment. Now, that judgment may be mistaken, just as at the perceptual level. I may be mistaken about that thing. So I may mistake it as having powers that it does not. So, I see some berries out in the wild and I think they're edible, but maybe they're not and they're poisonous and I die because of it. That is an economic error because you have tried to acquire something that has failed to meet your needs, and it's based on this error in apprehension. And so your desire for it is not itself is not in and of itself sufficient for determining its value. Now, your perception of it, erroneous as it is, will drive your behavior, but it's not sufficient to say, to have said you are correct, or there is an error there in your judgment because it doesn't actually meet your need. So the possibility of error in our judgments is a fundamental grounding for understanding, economic errors. And then alternatively, something might be good that we don't realize is good and we fail to acquire it. So this is part of this grounding. And so then you have a hierarchy of goods that you're deciding from that internally you've made judgments on, but those judgments maybe are more or less erroneous. And so then you end up misallocating resources, whether your labor or your money or so forth, into acquiring those things. And then, if we broaden this to a broader social context, this can become, society has misapprehended something, and so misallocates those resources to pursue something that doesn't actually meet the needs that we seek. And so I would argue that this is the case for like gold, because gold doesn't actually meet the need that we think it does. So the most gold is used for, a lot of gold is used for mainly jewelry. Some of it is used for industrial purposes or medicinal purposes. But a huge quantity, I think when I looked it up, it was something like 40%, is used just on, just on storage in vaults. Like it's just held as gold bullion. And so the reason for that is because it's considered a store of value, but it's only considered a store of value because everyone agrees that it's a store of value. And so because everyone agrees it's a store of value, then you can exchange it with other people. Now, that's not to say gold doesn't have real properties that are good. It has, it's malleable, it has high electrical and thermal conductivity, it's extremely durable, it doesn't tarnish easily, and so forth. But that is a very limited sort of utility. And so the issue then becomes that writ large, there's this misperception about the usefulness of gold, and so we end up misallocating resources to its acquisition and then non-use because we're using it for something that's irrelevant. Like, we would be wealthier as a society if that gold was put to use as in industrial or medicinal uses. And then the money that was spent on acquiring and purchasing that gold to hold was used elsewhere. You would have more businesses and more a wealthier economy rather than just vaults full of gold. So that's one potential example. Another example would be something like blockchain or quantum computing, that there's just this there's this explosion in excitement about this, and people thought these were going to be really amazing things. Resources were allocated to them thinking that this was going to be the greatest thing ever, and it just hasn't come about. Blockchain continues to be the solution that looks for a problem. Quantum computing continues to be, searching for quantum dominance and continuing to fail, and so forth. So there's this misallocation of resources which impoverishes us as an economy. And so that's an economic error. So I want to focus on that, because one of the criticisms I often get is that, there's a distinction between economic value and moral value. And sure, there can be moral error or, things that are immoral that are still, have economic value. And so that's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is that from economics, as economics, these are errors. So basically the point here is to say that there is a component of economics or of value that is grounded in, or I should say it's grounded in the good, the thing that actually meets our need, but it's grounded in it as arising from it and related to specifically our human constitution, and then our perception of that relation, which is an intellectual perception, or an intellection. Our awareness of that is what value is. And so then, based on that judgment, we may more or less pursue something among other many things. And we may be more or less in error with respect to that. And so because it's grounded in the thing, our analysis has to begin with that thing, with the intrinsic properties and qualities that it has, the things that it's useful for, and the way that it can meet our human needs. And so that's why when I was talking about gold, it does have useful properties to it. But what we treat it as valuable because it has this higher level of, because everyone else values it, we value it. And that ultimately becomes just ungrounded, because there's kind of that circularity. Well, I value it because you value it, and you value it because I value it. And so it's valuable because we all agree it's valuable, rather than it being grounded in the nature of gold itself, which, mind you, is what Aquinas does. Aquinas notes the properties of gold that make it valuable. And it's in the second part of the second part, Article 77, or Question 77, Article 3, I think. It's 2 or 3, where he talks about, for example, if you can sell fake gold, if it has the exact same properties, so like if an alchemist takes lead and turns it into gold, but it has the same properties as gold, then yeah, you could sell it as gold. And okay, so it's grounded in the thing itself. And so there's a few things here. There's a question of how do we value a thing when we consider it in itself? And so we don't consider it just as it is, just sitting there. We consider it as it can do things. So one of the things that goods can do is generate more goods. So an apple tree, you might consider it's good for wood or burning or whatever, but it can generate apples over time. And those apples are valuable too. And so the apple tree is itself something that generates more value. So its value isn't just what it can be consumed as right now, but also value it can generate into the future. Now, that power to generate value in the future is something intrinsic to it. So there's something in the nature of the apple tree that allows it to generate apples. And those apples are then valuable goods. So we can use something like time preference, which is generally said to be that future goods are not as valuable as present goods. And so this tree will generate goods out into the future, and then we can say that those goods out in the future are less valuable than goods here. So if an apple costs $1 today, an apple that could be generated in a year is maybe only worth 50 cents, for example. Now, conceptually, it's problematic because future things don't actually exist and therefore do not have value. And so, conceptually, the way I would rephrase at least what's behind the idea of time preference is to say that potential goods are less valuable than actual goods, because those apples are in a manner present in the apple tree because it has the power to generate them. And Kajetan makes this point as well. So he talks about how the potential versus the actual, and he does this with respect to usury. I won't get into specifics, but he does acknowledge this sort of thinking that a good that exists only in potency is less valuable than a good that exists actually. And I think that's the way, from a realist mindset, that we can think about the value of a tree in light of those, in light of the potential for it to create more apples, is the idea of potency. Now, you can come up with all sorts of mathematical ways and sort of abstractly treat those apples as if they exist and apply some mathematics called discounting to figure out some sort of specific value or quantity of value today. But really what you're valuing is the tree and its intrinsic power to generate more things. So that's what I would argue from a realist mindset. I think the problem with like Austrian economics and really even more broadly, finance and things, is the tendency to think that the tree is valuable because of the future apples, rather than the tree is valuable because of its intrinsic properties. And And I think a realist mindset has to move to that intrinsic properties. So the next thing, though, is that there's not just these sort of active potencies, which is the ability for it to generate other things, but also passive potencies. It's, to get into the metaphysics. And that's the ability for something to become something else. So, for example, iron has a certain value to it because of what it can become. It can become, a hardened steel. It can become this, that, or the other. Whereas, like, wood can't become necessarily those other things. Like, you can't necessarily come up, well, with some species of wood, you can come up with a pretty sharp knife. But, like with pine wood, you can't, it doesn't have the same potency to become something else the way that, like, iron does. Like, you can't make a sharp knife with that sort of durability the way with iron with pine that you could iron and so forth. And so there's a certain sense in which not only this ability to generate things, but the ability for a thing to become other things. And I've heard this same sort of mistaken thinking as well. Well, what it can become is what is really valuable. And so we're able to determine the value of the thing today because of that future valuable thing. No, it's grounded in the thing. The thing has a potential intrinsic to it to become that thing, and it's valuable because of that. So that is kind of some of the ways that I've started trying to think about this, and to approach it from a sort of metaphysical realism. And this impacts finance as well, mind you, because I think it only makes sense to apply things like, default risk and things like this when you realize it's the potency, because there's a potential for the person to pay their premiums, but there's all sorts of impediments that might come along and prevent that. So there's all sorts of things that might prevent the tree from generating fruit, like disease or drought or whatever. So those future apples that don't exist may never exist. But the potential is in the tree right now, independent of any sort of future consideration. Now, because it's potential, you do have to consider all those impediments because it has to eventually be realized. But I think the consideration of those impediments then becomes, it's in relation to that power, that potential being actualized. And so, in finance, I think this is true as well. Like we talk about in insurance, like risk transfer. Like an insurance company is taking on the risk of the insured, and in a literal sense, that's not true at all. And I'm really surprised when I look at the regulations and things that I haven't found a real recognition of this, because we talk about assumed and ceded risk as if these were not metaphorical, and that you're paying for that transfer of risk. Where what's really happening is, well, you have a risk. So my car, for example, it exists. There is a risk that I will get into a wreck at some point. Now, when I get into a wreck, I suffer some sort of financial loss. That risk has been realized. It hasn't been transferred. Now, when I go to the insurer, I say, hey, I've had this realized loss. You need to pay your benefits to me. And they're like, okay, we'll give you your benefits after an investigation, etc. And maybe they don't because of, contractual terms and things like that, and what's covered and what's not, and so forth. And really, I'm not transferring risk. I am actually paying for a claim against their property that exists right now. And so I, a lot of this doesn't change necessarily most of the conclusions that we reach, but it reframes the discussion in such a way that we have a better understanding of what's really going on, so that we can really start judging more fringe cases. So, like, for example, there's all sorts of questions, like with gold, for example. We can coherently say, well, like, gold is not as valuable as we think it is. And so, and Bitcoin or blockchain or whatever, we can have those kind of discussions. And so it helps reframe things and helps kind of limit things. And from a usury perspective, it also gives us the opportunity to be able to understand why usury is evil and why it's not justified, even though, you know, someone may value receiving, you know, 5% a year from a personally secured loan, that it's still like not economically even sensible. So this went longer than I thought, but I appreciate you taking the time to listen to this. You know, feedback, comments, anything, leave it down below. I appreciate that. And yeah, thank you. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.